We find ourselves at the end of November 1942. After a pincer attack on Stalingrad, the Soviets have managed to surround almost 300,000 Axis soldiers around the city and tear apart several armies of Germany's allies. With this action, the Germans went from being on the verge of closing the campaign of that year, 1942, with positive results with the conquest of Stalingrad, the advance to the Volga, and the capture of areas with abundant minerals of all kinds and oil, to a completely catastrophic situation. While a rescue operation was being organized in a hurry, which we already saw extensively in another program, the Soviets did not stand idly by and prepared to begin another series of offensives that would finish off the German Army Group South. Although Manstein's operation to reach the Stalingrad pocket began on December 12th, the Soviets launched the offensive much further north just one day later. The entire front around the Don River quickly sank alarmingly, and the Soviets opened a large gap south of the city of Voronezh. After overcoming the 2nd Hungarian Army and the 8th Italian Army, as well as other German formations that could not face the avalanche that was coming upon them, the Soviet vanguards began to approach dangerously close to Rostov. This was precisely what Manstein feared most, since the situation he faced was no longer whether or not to lose the 6th Army in Stalingrad, but rather his entire army group that could be crushed against the Sea of Azov. Let's make a small aside here to explain that German calculations indicated time and time again that the Soviet Union was about to collapse and that its army was totally exhausted after all the losses it had suffered. This made them continually think that the Soviets were not going to be able to launch any major offensive, and if they did, they would not be able to get very far into the German rear. Once again, they were wrong. When Manstein saw the critical situation he faced, he had to paralyze his rescue attack on Stalingrad and request the complete withdrawal of Army Group A, which was in the Caucasus at full speed. Given the seriousness of the matter, Hitler had to call Mussolini in person to ask him to make a special appeal to his army to maintain their position at all costs and not to retreat. Although the Italian leader did what he could, it was here that Mussolini began to insist again and again that peace had to be reached with Stalin. Let us remember that around this time, the situation in North Africa had also turned against the Italians and Germans, and if that were not enough, the Americans had also reached Tunisia. Once Manstein presents all these withdrawal proposals to Hitler, the German leader again and again refuses to give ground, and his order is to maintain positions. Here we see an attempt to repeat what had already happened during the previous winter against Moscow, because it had gone relatively well. But on this occasion, this strategy would not work. By the beginning of 1943, the German situation on the southern flank of the Eastern Front was unsustainable. The Axis armies had completely abandoned the banks of the Don River and were now seeking refuge on the line of the Donets River. On the other hand, Paulus's troops continued to resist in Stalingrad, although all hope of saving them had long been lost, and the German positions were increasingly farther from the city. Finding Rostov totally threatened by the Red Army that was hitting the Germans hard along the entire line, during the last days of December 1942, Manstein finally obtained Hitler's authorization to withdraw Army Group A. However, Hitler wanted to maintain as large a bridgehead in the South Caucasus as possible. The idea was to resume the offensive from there, heading towards the Soviet oil fields as soon as they could. After strong discussions during mid-January, in which the size of troops that should remain in the Kuban was debated, there was finally no other option but to leave the fewest possible and send the rest of the units to the northwest of Rostov to reinforce the area. The 4th Panzer Army was doing everything possible to keep the Rostov corridor open, through which the German troops had to pass if they did not want to be surrounded, but it was only a matter of time before the Soviets finally reached the city. Meanwhile, further north, the Red Army continued to advance without anything being able to stop it, reconquering the city of Voronezh by January 24th and seriously threatening the cities of Kursk, Kharkov, and Belgorod. At the same time, and let us not forget, the Sixth Army continued fighting in Stalingrad, although its surrender was already close. A few days earlier, on January 18th, Hitler banned furloughs on the entire Eastern Front, and no soldiers were sent home. All men, regardless of their situation, had to remain at their post and defend their position tooth and nail. By early February 1943, the German line was fixed on the Donau River, forming a dangerous curve that was indefensible. Manstein told Hitler that if they did not retreat west of the Meuse River, the majority of the German army on the southern flank was in great danger of being annihilated. The reason why Hitler refused to abandon this part of the Donetsk Basin, which is so famous today, is because there are enormous quantities of coal, among other minerals, in it. According to Hitler, this raw material was essential for the German military industry, which depended on it to increase its production. On February 5th and 6th, meetings were called at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to determine the economic importance of these regions. Albert Speer himself was invited to it and declared that the really valuable mineral was found west of the Meuse River and that they could afford to abandon the other part of the Donetsk Basin. Thanks to these statements, the withdrawal was finally authorized. As we see on the map, the curve of the German defensive line was increasingly pronounced, and the Soviets were already pressing from the south of Kharkov in the direction of the Dnieper River. Finally, on February 14th, the Germans completed their withdrawal after abandoning Rostov and the lower reaches of the Donets River. With this, they hoped to be able to strengthen their left flank as much as possible, but it was still not enough. At this point, we have to talk about a very important element in this entire event, which is the entry into combat of the famous Waffen SS Panzer Corps. This formation was made up of the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, in which Hitler had placed all his hope to resolve the situation. Initially, they were going to be in charge of breaking the siege of Stalingrad, but as it took a long time to be transferred from France, they arrived too late for that. Despite the great equipment and training of these units, Manstein did not have special hope in them, and the truth is that he did not look favorably on them. So much so that in his memories, the Marshal failed to give these units the merit they truly deserved. The main problem that Manstein had with these divisions was that he considered them to be poorly led by his various generals and commanders. In any case, the Leibstandarte and Das Reich managed to reach the Eastern Front by the end of January and the beginning of February. They were quickly sent east of Belgorod and Kharkov to defend the banks of the Oskol River and launch the offensive as quickly as they could. Let us remember again that the Germans were constantly waiting for the Soviets to stop and recover from the great efforts made during the last few months. However, the troops that had been surrounding Stalingrad were about to arrive, and with this, they would be reinforced even more. During the 5th, 6th, and 7th, the Das Reich Division was launching a series of minor counterattacks in its area while waiting for its sister divisions to accompany it, as they were still in transit. Even when the Leibstandarte joined the Das Reich, they could not do much to contain the Soviets because, in addition to greatly outnumbering them, they were attacking on a very wide front, and if they remained resisting in any sector, they would end up being surrounded. This is exactly what would happen to them in Kharkov in mid-February, in which, despite failing to comply with Hitler's direct orders, they had to withdraw if they did not want to be annihilated. Sitting now on February 20th, the situation we have on the front is as follows. Starting from north to south, the Soviets have driven the Germans out of the cities of Kursk, Belgorod, and Kharkov, now forming a new, more or less horizontal line. Further down, we find that although the Germans have abandoned the Donets Basin in the Rostov salient and have occupied the bank of the Meuse River, their positions are still very advanced, forming a dangerous curve. This weak flank that the 1st Panzer Army defended began to be attacked massively, like the entire German front further north on February 7th, and the Soviets did not stop until finally, on the 14th, they managed to open a large gap in the German positions. By the 20th, the vanguards of the Red Army were advancing freely towards the south, with nothing standing between them and the Sea of Azov. If they finally managed to reach the city of Mariupol, a strong contingent of German troops would be surrounded again. The situation was so serious that on the 19th, when Hitler himself met with Manstein at the Zaporozhye barracks, he was informed that the Soviets were only 60 kilometers away and that there was no significant German force between them and the enemy. These Soviet units, as we see on the map, corresponded to the strong gap that the Red Army had managed to open a week before, and which was advancing without opposition. It should be noted that Hitler was considering whether to dismiss Manstein due to how chaotic the situation was, and that he very possibly would have done so if he had not had to leave the barracks in such a hasty manner as he had to do on February 19th at 1:45 p.m. However, when all seemed lost, Manstein's turn came. Taking advantage of a series of weak and worn divisions that had been concentrated north of the city of Stalino and belonged to the 1st Panzer Army, Manstein began a counterattack on the 21st against the flank of the Soviet penetration that was heading south. The 7th, 11th, and 17th Panzer Divisions participate in this offensive, along with the Viking Division of the Waffen SS. Added to this attack is another attack from the west by the 4th Panzer Army and the SS Panzer Corps, which in a few days managed to completely close the gap opened on the German front, and by February 28th, they once again reached the line of the Donets. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued to launch attacks against the German Second Army and against the Center Army Group, causing the German front west of Belgorod and Kursk to do nothing but retreat. This presented a great opportunity to launch a strong counterattack on the Soviet left flank, which would completely cut off the offensive. Although Hitler wanted it to reach as far north as possible quickly, Manstein was more cautious and warned of the dangers that this action could lead to. Given the anticipated thaw that was taking place that year, on March 1st, Manstein sent a message to Hitler's headquarters in which he said the following: "As tempting as it may be to advance north across the Donets toward the enemy's rear, there are now numerous complications due to road conditions. There is a danger that the operation will get stuck in the mud. Although this danger existed, the opportunity was too good to pass up, and by March 5th, the German units south of the Donets rushed north with everything they had. The most immediate objective was to reconquer the city of Kharkov, which had become a strong political symbol, and from that point on continue as far as possible. Little by little, the Germans began to break through, and by the middle of the month, they managed to regain control of Kharkov. They then continued advancing until the Leibstandarte and the Grobdeutschland reached Belgorod on the 22nd. At the same time, and although in a more timid manner, the Center Army Group had also been able to stop the Soviet offensive in its sector and had made them retreat towards the east. In short, on March 23, 1943, given the impossibility of continuing to carry out operations due to the mud season and the wear and tear that the units have suffered during so many months of uninterrupted combat, this is the new situation on the Eastern Front, in which you can see the characteristic Kursk ledge. As you all know, he will be the protagonist of the Great Summer Operation of that same year. Next, let's look at the real impact and consequences of this operation. During these 4 weeks that Manstein's counterattack lasted, the Germans managed to cause some 200,000 casualties to the Soviet army, including dead, wounded, and prisoners, and destroyed 1,200 tanks. In addition, they completely disrupted the Soviet offensive that sought to encircle them in front of the Sea of Azov and managed to stabilize the entire central and southeastern front. After the great catastrophe suffered during the months of November, December, and January, in which it seemed that everything was going to fall apart, the result obtained was the best possible. During the next month of April, it was all congratulations and words of optimism. Permissions were again granted for the soldiers to return to their homes, and it was possible to obtain about 3 months of tranquility on the front, where there was hardly any fighting. This brought a stability in which both sides could strengthen themselves in relation to what their industries allowed. Finally, the Germans had also reinforced the confidence that their allies had begun to lose in them after the disaster at Stalingrad. Likewise, morale among the German population also increased, since during the winter months they had been affected by numerous negative news stories that ended up leaking about the bad situation on the Eastern Front. In summary, this victory that Manstein obtained was a huge ball of oxygen for a Third Reich that could hardly achieve victory against the Soviet Union. And that's it for this program, which I personally consider to have been one of the best I have done during these years. I sincerely hope that you liked it and that you value the effort behind each of these deliveries.